Chapter 1. A routine stop turns hostile. Aisha Thompson had seen her share of danger. For 15 years, she'd served as a CIA operative, navigating war zones in the Middle East, disarming threats with a cool head and a steady hand. At 38, she'd retired to a quieter life in Atlanta, trading covert missions for family cookouts and weekend drives. That afternoon, though, as she pulled over on a quiet road in the suburbs to check a flat tire, she had no idea the skills she'd honed overseas would soon be tested again, not by a foreign enemy, but by a man in a badge. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Aisha knelt by her sedan, running her fingers along the rubber to find the puncture. She'd just come from her cousin's place, the smell of barbecue still lingering on her clothes. Her phone sat on the hood, flashlight app on. As she muttered to herself about needing a spare, that's when the flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She stood, brushing dirt off her jeans, as Officer Greg Harper stepped out of his patrol car. He was a broad-shouldered white man in his late 40s. His uniform crisp but his demeanor anything but friendly. His hand rested on his holster as he approached, eyes narrowing at her like she was a suspect in a lineup. Aisha's instincts kicked in. 15 years in the CIA had taught her to read people like open books. And this one screamed trouble. Papers. Now, Harper barked, skipping any greeting. His flashlight beam hit her face, harsh and blinding. Aisha raised a hand to shield her eyes, keeping her voice even. I'm just checking a flat tire. Officer, what's the problem? Harper's lip curled. Don't get smart with me. ID and registration. Move it. His tone carried an edge, a subtle accusation that didn't need spelling out. Aisha had felt it before, too many times. She was a black woman in a mostly white suburb, and to some, that alone made her suspicious. It was the kind of unspoken bias she'd learned to navigate growing up in Georgia. But it still stung. I'll get them, she said, reaching slowly for her purse on the passenger seat. She kept her movements deliberate, aware of how quickly things could escalate. Can you tell me why you stopped me? That was the trigger. Harper's face hardened. I don't need a reason. You're questioning me? He stepped closer, his voice rising. Turn around. Hands on the car. Aisha frowned. I haven't done anything. Now. Harper grabbed her arm, spinning her toward the patrol car. Her shoulder slammed against the cold metal, and for a split second, her training flared up. She could have disarmed him in 3 moves, snap his wrist, take his gun, leave him on the ground. But she didn't. She wasn't in a war zone. This was home, and she wasn't about to give him the excuse he clearly wanted. Instead, she let her body go still, hands pressed flat against the hood. You're resisting, Harper shouted, though she hadn't moved an inch. You attacked me. His voice was loud, performative, like he was already rehearsing for a report. He yanked her wrists behind her back, snapping on cuffs tight enough to bite into her skin. Aisha clenched her jaw, the taste of iron rising in her throat as she bit back a retort. She'd faced worse, interrogations in dusty bunkers, ambushes in the dead of night, but this was different. This was personal. As he shoved her into the back of his cruiser, Harper kept up the act. You think you can fight me? You're done. Aisha caught his reflection in the window, smirking, triumphant, oblivious to who he'd just tangled with. She closed her eyes, breathing slow and deep, the way she'd learned to center herself before a mission. This wasn't over. She'd fight, but not with fists. This battle belonged in a courtroom. Hours later, at the precinct, Harper typed up his report with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. Assault on an officer, resisting arrest, lies stacked on lies. Aisha sat in a holding cell, her wrists still raw, replaying the encounter. She'd questioned his motives, and he'd escalated textbook abuse of power. She'd seen it before, not just in her own life but in the stories of friends, family, strangers on the news, black folks stopped for driving while black, harassed for existing in spaces where people like Harper thought they didn't belong. The next morning, her cousin bailed her out, fury in his eyes. They're saying you attacked him. Aisha, that's bullshit. She nodded, her expression calm but her mind racing. I know, they've got no idea what's coming. Back home, she called Jamal Carter, a young black lawyer she'd met through a mutual friend. He was green, barely out of law school, but he had fire in him. Over the phone, his voice crackled with nerves. Aisha, this is bad. It's your word against his. And he's a cop. Juries eat that up. Jamal, she said, her tone steady. I've handled worse odds. Get me in front of a judge. We'll see who's telling the truth. The arraignment came fast. Aisha stood in a cramped courtroom, Harper's charges hanging over her like a storm cloud. He sat across the room, arms crossed, smirking again as the prosecutor read the accusations. The defendant became hostile, attempted to disarm Officer Harper during a routine stop. Whispers rippled through the gallery, skepticism, curiosity, judgment. Aisha kept her eyes forward, hands clasped, her posture a relic of years spent standing tall under pressure. Jamal leaned in, his brow creased. We need more than your story. He's got the badge on his side. Aisha's lips curved, just slightly. Patience. Jamal, truth has a way of showing up when you least expect it. As the prosecution built its case, Aisha's mind drifted back to that night, the flashlight in her face, the sneer in Harper's voice, the way he'd assumed she was a threat before she'd even spoken. She'd spent years defending a country that didn't always defend her back. And now here she was, fighting for her name against a man who saw her skin before he saw her humanity. But she wasn't afraid. She'd faced down terrorists, outsmarted spies. Greg Harper didn't know it yet, but he'd picked the wrong woman to mess with. Chapter 2. The Courtroom Showdown. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tension as Aisha Thompson stood at the defendant's table, her dark eyes fixed on the judge. It had been 3 weeks since Officer Greg Harper slammed her against his patrol car, spinning a web of lies that landed her here, facing charges of assaulting an officer and resisting arrest. The room buzzed with anticipation, a mix of reporters, curious locals, and a few of Harper's fellow cops filling the gallery. Aisha's navy blazer hugged her frame, her posture unshaken, a remnant of years spent staring down threats far deadlier than this. Jamal Carter, her young lawyer, fidgeted beside her, flipping through notes with sweaty palms. At 26, he was brilliant but untested, and the weight of going up against a cop's word pressed hard on him. Aisha, he whispered, they're about to call Harper. If he sticks to his story, we're in deep. Juries love a uniform. Aisha didn't flinch. Let him talk. Jamal, liars trip over their own tongues eventually. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit, called Harper to the stand. He strode up with the swagger of a man who'd never lost, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He swore in, then launched into his tale. I approached the defendant on a routine patrol, he said, voice steady but loud, like he was addressing a crowd. She was hostile from the start, refused to comply, questioned my authority. When I tried to de-escalate, she lunged at me, grabbed for my weapon. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Aisha's jaw tightened, but she kept still, her hands folded calmly on the table. Harper's words weren't just lies, they were loaded, painting her as the angry black woman, a stereotype she'd seen weaponized too often. It was the kind of subtle bias that juries swallowed without blinking, black people branded as threats, their voices dismissed. Fan Biad Gong. Jamal scribbled furiously, muttering, he's good, too good, we need something solid. Aisha leaned closer, her voice low, we've got it, trust me. The prosecutor circled back, pressing Harper, so you felt threatened, officer? Absolutely, he said, nodding gravely. She's strong, aggressive. I had no choice but to restrain her. His eyes flicked to Aisha, a glint of triumph in them. He thought he'd won. Then it was Jamal's turn. He stood, smoothing his tie, and approached the stand. Officer Harper, you say Ms. Thompson attacked you. Can you describe exactly how she grabbed for your weapon? Harper shifted, just slightly. She, reached toward my holster. Quick move, like she knew what she was doing. Interesting, Jamal said, pacing. Because we have a recording that tells a different story. The room went quiet as he signaled the clerk. A grainy audio clip crackled through the speakers, captured by a passerby's dashcam. Harper's voice boomed. Kogi min lai ma dam kai lai toi? Noi nu ko can be at cho kua min. The words hung heavy, dripping with contempt. Murmurs erupted in the gallery, disgust flickering across faces. Harper's composure cracked, his hands gripping the stand. That's out of context. Out of context? Jamal cut in, holding up a transcript. You told her to know her place. What place was that, officer? The question landed like a punch. Harper stammered, but Jamal didn't let up. Let's talk about your record. 6 complaints of excessive force in 5 years, all against minorities. Mostly black women, all buried by your department. Care to explain? The prosecutor objected. Irrelevant, but the judge overruled, his expression darkening. Answer the question, officer. Harper's face reddened. Those were misunderstandings. I do my job. Your job, Jamal said, seems to involve targeting people who look like my client. Like the time you fined a black man 3 times in 1 month for loitering in his own driveway. Or the black teenager you roughed up for suspicious behavior. She was walking home from school. He slapped a stack of documents on the table. Patterns don't lie, officer. You do. Fan be it gom. He thong che jiao q nai. Thien v gun sat da trang. The gallery buzzed louder now. Harper's fellow officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Aisha watched it all, her calm unbroken. But inside, she felt the tide turning. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every person Harper had bullied. Every voice silenced by his badge. Then she took the stand. The room fell silent as she spoke, her voice clear and steady. My name is Aisha Thompson. I'm a retired CIA operative, 15 years in covert operations. That night, I was checking a flat tire when Officer Harper approached. He didn't ask questions, he demanded my ID. And when I asked why, he shoved me against his car. I didn't resist, I didn't reach for his weapon. I stayed calm, because that's what I was trained to do. The prosecutor pounced, leaning in. So you admit you questioned his authority? I questioned his motives, Aisha corrected, her gaze unwavering. There's a difference. He saw a black woman on the roadside and assumed I was trouble. That's not law enforcement, that's prejudice. A juror, a middle-aged black woman, leaned forward, nodding slightly. Harper's smirk was gone now, replaced by a sheen of sweat. Aisha pressed on. I've faced enemies abroad, risked my life for this country. I've been shot at, interrogated, ambushed, but I never expected to be treated like a criminal in my own hometown, for doing nothing but existing. Jamal stepped up, his voice ringing out. My client didn't assault Officer Harper. She did something far worse in his eyes. She dared to ask why. A black woman who knows her rights. That's what he couldn't stand. That's why he lied. The closing arguments hit hard. The prosecutor doubled down, calling Aisha defiant, but the word felt hollow now. Jamal countered. This isn't about defiance. It's about dignity. Ms. Thompson spent years protecting our freedoms, only to have hers trampled by a man who abused his power. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Aisha sat in quiet reflection. Jamal paced, chewing his lip. You think they'll buy it? He asked. She smiled faintly. They'll see the truth. They always do. Eventually. Outside, the courthouse hummed with chatter, reporters typing furiously, locals whispering about the CIA lady. Aisha stood by a window, watching the city stretch out below. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was bigger, about accountability. About a system that too often shielded men like Harper while crushing people like her. She'd faced worse odds and won. Now, she waited. Chapter 3. Justice and a Movement Born. The deliberation didn't take long. Less than 2 hours after the jury filed out, they returned to the courtroom. Their faces a mix of resolve and unease. Aisha Thompson sat at the defendant's table, her hands still clasped, her breathing steady, a discipline carved into her from years as a CIA operative. Jamal Carter, her young lawyer, stopped pacing and gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. The gallery hushed as the foreman stood, clearing his throat. On the charge of assaulting an officer, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, not guilty. A collective exhale swept the room, followed by murmurs that swelled into a low roar. But the foreman wasn't done. We also recommend a full investigation into Officer Greg Harper's conduct and the practices of his department. This can't stand. The judge's gavel banged, sharp and final. Aisha's lips curved into a faint smile, not of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. Jamal slumped into his chair, grinning like a kid who'd just aced his first test. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Across the room, Harper sat frozen, his face drained of color. A few of his fellow officers in the gallery slipped out the back, their once solid support crumbling under the weight of the truth. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Officer Harper, this court orders an immediate review of your past cases. You're suspended pending investigation." Harper's head dropped, his badge suddenly looking more like a burden than a shield. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with energy. Reporters swarmed Aisha as she stepped onto the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her. She stood tall, the same strength that had carried her through covert missions now radiating in the late afternoon light. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's about accountability. I fought for this country overseas, and I'll keep fighting here, for justice. For everyone who's been wronged by those meant to protect us." The clip went viral within hours. #Justice for Aisha trended on Twitter, her words echoing across social media. Harper's lies unraveled fast. He was dismissed from the force days later, facing perjury charges that could land him behind bars. But for Aisha, the real victory wasn't in his downfall. It was in what came next. In the weeks that followed, her story sparked a fire. Community groups reached out, begging her to speak. Aisha teamed up with civil rights organizers, hosting workshops in Atlanta's rec centers and church basements. She taught people how to document encounters with police, how to stay calm under pressure, skills she'd honed in the CIA, now repurposed for a different battlefield. Her sessions drew crowds. Parents worried for their kids, teens tired of being profiled, even a few cops who wanted to listen. One evening, at a packed community center, a young white officer named Ryan stood up during Q&A. His uniform was wrinkled, his voice shaky. "I've been on the job 2 years," he said. "They taught us to trust our gut in training. And I've stopped black folks for nothing, just because I was told they're more likely to be trouble. I didn't question it until I heard you. I want to do better." The room went quiet, then erupted in applause. Aisha nodded, meeting his eyes. "That's where it starts, Ryan. Questioning what you're taught, changing what you do." It was a small moment, but it stuck with her, a crack in the system, a sign that her fight could ripple further than she'd imagined. Her story didn't stop at Atlanta. Departments nationwide took notice, some out of fear, others out of necessity. Harper's case led to 30 reopened complaints, exposing a pattern of misconduct that stretched back years. Aisha's name became a rallying cry, her military discipline and quiet courage lending weight to a growing movement. She spoke at police academies, her unique perspective as both a veteran and a victim cutting through the noise. "Power without accountability is tyranny," she'd say. "You're not above us, you're with us." Months later, standing on those same courthouse steps at dusk, Aisha watched the skyline glow orange. Her phone buzzed. Another precinct, this time in Chicago, asking her to train their rookies. She smiled, remembering how a flat tire had spiraled into this. Her fight had given courage to others, people who'd faced the same harassment but lacked her platform. One woman, a single mom from Decatur, wrote to her, "I was scared to speak up when it happened to me. You made me believe I could." That was the real win. Not just clearing her name, but amplifying voices that had been drowned out too long. The bias was still there. Black folks stopped for looking suspicious. Their words doubted in court. Their complaints buried, fan be it gone. But Aisha's story chipped away at it, proving one person's truth could force a reckoning. She started a podcast, Unseen Battles, sharing stories of everyday people who'd faced down injustice: janitors, teachers, kids on skateboards. It hit 50,000 downloads in a month, each episode ending with her voice. The toughest fights aren't always with guns or fists. They're with persistence, with truth. Keep speaking, keep standing. Back at the community center, she'd tell the cadets, cops and civilians alike, "I didn't win because I was CIA. I won because I refused to let a lie define me. You don't need a badge or a gun to fight. You need a spine." The room would nod, some teary-eyed, others fired up. Ryan, the young cop, became a regular, bringing colleagues who'd started questioning their own gut. One night, as she locked up after a session, Jamal caught up with her, grinning. "You're a movement now, Aisha. They're calling you the voice of the silenced." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm just a woman who got tired of being pushed. The rest is them. The people who kept going after me." The sky darkened, stars peeking through. Aisha glanced at her car, the same sedan, tire long fixed, and felt a strange peace. She'd spent years defending freedom abroad. But this fight, right here at home, was her truest mission. It wasn't over. It might never be. But every step, every voice, every changed mind was a victory one Harper, and 1,000 like him, couldn't take away.